The auctioneer's hammer struck the wooden podium with a sharp crack that echoed through the dusty barn, but nobody was listening to the livestock announcements. All eyes were fixed on the man in the corner, specifically on the ridiculous excuse for a hat perched atop his weathered head. Kestrel Bronson stood perfectly still as whispers and snickers rippled through the crowd of well-dressed buyers. His hat, if it could still be called that, had seen better decades. The brim hung at odd angles, held together by what appeared to be fishing line and stubborn hope. Patches of different fabrics covered holes like a patchwork quilt, and the original color had long since faded to an indeterminate shade of brown-gray. Most embarrassing of all, bits of hay and what looked like old bandages dangled from the crown like sorry party streamers. "Look at that scarecrow," chuckled Beaumont Ashford, adjusting his pristine Stetson. "Someone should tell him this is a horse auction, not a costume party." "I heard he's been wearing that thing for 30 years, whispered Cordelia Whitmore, her manicured fingers smoothing her silk blazer. Absolutely revolting. Kestrel heard every word, but kept his focus on the magnificent stallion being led into the ring. Midnight Star was a creature of pure beauty, coal-black coat gleaming under the barn lights, muscles rippling with each graceful step. The horse's eyes held intelligence and fire, but also something else that made Kestrel's chest tighten: pain, fear, the kind of wariness that came from being handled by too many rough hands. The bidding started at $5,000 and climbed rapidly. Ashford raised his paddle with casual arrogance, his gold watch catching the light. Whitmore countered with a lazy wave of her hand. These people saw dollar signs and bloodlines and trophies on walls. They didn't see the trembling in the horse's legs or the way he flinched. When the handler raised the lead rope, $25,000, Ashford called out, his voice carrying the confidence of old money. 30. Whitmore responded without missing a beat. The crowd murmured with appreciation. This was the kind of spectacle they'd come to see, two wealthy rivals battling over a prize stallion. Meanwhile, the farmer in the corner with his laughable hat might as well have been invisible. Kestrel watched as Midnight Star's ears flattened against his head. The horse's nostrils flared, and he stamped the ground with increasing agitation. The handler jerked the lead rope, causing the stallion to rear up on his hind legs with a sound that was part whinny, part scream. 35,000, Ashford's voice cut through the horse's distress. That's when Kestrel slowly raised his own paddle, a piece of cardboard, with 47 scrawled in black marker. 40,000, he said quietly. The barn fell silent except for the horse's labored breathing. Every head turned to stare at the man in the ridiculous hat, their expressions ranging from shock to amusement to outright disdain. 40,000? Ashford's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Are you serious? You look like you can't afford a decent hat, let alone a thoroughbred." But Kestrel wasn't looking at Ashford. He was looking at Midnight Star, whose wild eyes had found him across the crowded barn. For just a moment, the horse's panicked breathing slowed, and his ears pricked forward with what almost looked like recognition. 45. Whitmore snapped, her patience clearly wearing thin. 50. Kestrel replied, his voice steady as stone. The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. The man in the tattered hat had just made a serious bid. Midnight Star's reaction was immediate and startling. The stallion's entire demeanor shifted as he craned his neck toward Kestrel, nostrils flaring wide as if trying to catch a scent across the crowded barn. His ears swiveled forward, no longer pinned back in fear, and the frantic stamping of his hooves gradually stilled. 55,000. Ashford's voice cracked slightly, his earlier confidence wavering as he watched the horses' bizarre behavior. 60. Kestrel responded, never taking his eyes off the stallion. The crowd was no longer laughing. Something strange was happening, and even the most cynical among them could sense it. Midnight Star was pulling against his lead rope, but not. In panic, he was trying to move closer to the farmer in the corner. The handler struggled to keep the powerful animal in place, shooting confused glances at the auctioneer. "What's gotten into him?" muttered the handler, a thick-set man named Rusty who'd been working horse auctions for 20 years. Cordelia Whitmore's jaw tightened as she watched her prize slip away. 65,000. She called out, her voice sharp with irritation. 70. Kestrel replied without hesitation. The number hung in the air like a challenge. Ashford's hand gripped his paddle so tightly his knuckles went white. Whitmore's perfectly composed facade cracked just enough to reveal the fury beneath. Neither of them had expected serious competition from the man they'd dismissed as a joke. But Midnight Star was no longer looking at anyone else. His dark eyes remained fixed on Kestrel's face, and more specifically, on the ridiculous hat that had drawn so much mockery. The stallion's breathing had steadied, and an almost eerie calm had settled over him. "I don't understand," whispered someone in the crowd. "It's like he knows that guy." Kestrel's weathered hands trembled slightly as he held his paddle. His savings account was about to be emptied, but he'd seen something in the horse's eyes that transcended money. Recognition, hope, trust. 75,000. Ashford's voice was strained now, the casual arrogance replaced by desperation. 80. Kestrel replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The barn had gone completely quiet except for the soft nickering sounds coming from Midnight Star. The horse was making a sound none of them had heard before, gentle, almost conversational, as if he were trying to communicate across the distance. Whitmore's paddle started to rise, then faltered. Ashford opened his mouth to counter, then closed it. Something about the scene unfolding before them had shaken even these hardened competitors. The connection between the shabby farmer and the magnificent stallion was undeniable, and somehow it made their own bids feel hollow. 80,000, go in once, the auctioneer called out, his usual rapid-fire patter subdued. Go in twice. Kestrel's heart hammered against his ribs. Everything he'd saved for the past 15 years was about to disappear in a single moment. His small farm would struggle without that safety net. But looking at Midnight Star, seeing the way the horse's ears stayed pricked toward him, the way his tail had stopped its anxious swishing, Kestrel knew he couldn't walk away. Sold to bidder number 47, the hammer fell, and the crowd erupted in a mixture of applause and confused murmurs. Kestrel stood frozen for a moment, hardly believing what had just happened. Then Midnight Star let out a sound that was part whinny, part celebration, and pulled so hard against his lead rope that Rusty nearly lost his grip. Easy, boy, the handler grunted, but the horse's attention was entirely focused on his new owner. As Kestrel made his way through the crowd toward the ring, he could feel every eye upon him. The whispers followed him like shadows. 80,000 for a horse, and he can't even buy a decent hat. What's he thinking? Did you see how that horse reacted to him? But Kestrel heard none of it. His focus was entirely on the magnificent creature that had somehow chosen him. Across a crowded barn, as he approached, Midnight Star's head lowered, and he let out a soft, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. It was the sound of recognition, of coming home. The paperwork took an hour to complete, but Kestrel barely noticed the legal formalities. His attention was entirely consumed by Midnight Star, who had grown increasingly agitated as the crowd began to disperse. The stallion's calm demeanor from the auction ring was evaporating, replaced by the same nervous energy that had marked his entrance. He's been through for owners in 2 years, Rusty explained as he handed over the lead rope. Beautiful horse, but he's got a mean streak a mile wide. Bites, kicks, won't let anyone ride him. Last owner was about to ship him off to. He didn't finish the sentence, but Kestrel understood. What happened to his first owner? Kestrel asked, running his hand along the stallion's neck. The horse's skin twitched at the touch, but he didn't pull away. Old rancher named Stellan Moorfield. Died about 3 years ago. That's when the horse's troubles started. Been bouncing around ever since, getting more dangerous each time. Kestrel's hand stilled on the horse's neck. Moorfield, I knew. Him, we were neighbors for a while, back in Montana. Well, that explains it then, Rusty said, shaking his head. Horses remember scents, voices, faces. This one's been looking for something familiar ever since Stellan passed. As they walked toward the trailer, Midnight Star's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He shied away from every person they passed, his ears flattening whenever someone got too close. But his eyes never left Kestrel, and specifically, they never left the tattered hat. Easy, boy, Kestrel murmured, but the horse was working himself into a frenzy. His hooves danced on the gravel, and foam began to gather at the corners of his mouth. That's when Kestrel noticed something that made his breath catch. As a gust of wind lifted the dangling pieces of fabric from his hat, Midnight Star's head snapped up. Following the movement with laser focus, the horse's nostrils flared wide, and he stretched his neck toward the floating scraps as if trying to catch them. With sudden understanding, Kestrel reached up and carefully untied one of the larger pieces of fabric, a faded blue square that had been patched over a hole in the crown. The moment it came free, Midnight Star's entire demeanor changed. His ears pricked forward, his breathing steadied, and he took a step closer. "What in the hell?" Rusty muttered, watching in amazement as the dangerous stallion became docile the moment he caught the scent of the fabric. Kestrel held the piece of cloth closer to the horse's nose, and Midnight Star inhaled deeply before letting out a soft, almost mournful sound. His massive head drooped, and for a moment, he looked less like a fierce stallion and more like a lost child. "This isn't just any fabric," Kestrel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "This is from Stellan's old horse blanket, the one he used on his first stallion, Thunder. When Thunder died, Stellan couldn't bear to throw it away. He gave me pieces of it when I was going through my own hard times, said it would bring me luck." The memories came flooding back. Stellan Moorfield, gruff and kind, showing up at Kestrel's door during the worst period of his life. Kestrel's wife had just died, the farm was failing, and he'd been ready to give up everything. Stellan had sat on his porch for hours, sharing stories and wisdom, and when he'd left, he'd handed Kestrel pieces of Thunder's blanket. "That horse was like a son to me," Stellan had said, "and this blanket, it's got love woven into every thread. You stitch these into that old hat of yours, and whenever life gets hard, you'll remember that love doesn't die, it just changes form over the years." Kestrel had added more pieces to his hat, scraps from other horses, other friends, other memories. Each patch told a story, each thread held a connection to something precious. The hat wasn't just tattered fabric held together by hope. It was a living monument to love, loss, and the threads that bind all living things together. "He can smell it," Kestrel whispered, watching as Midnight Star gently nuzzled the fabric. "He can smell Thunder, and Stellan, and 30 years of memories." The horse's eyes closed as he pressed his nose against the cloth, and for the first time since his owner's death, Midnight Star looked at peace. The ride to Kestrel's farm was a revelation. Midnight Star, who had been described as dangerous and unpredictable, stood calmly in the trailer, his head lowered in what could only be described as meditation. Every few minutes, he would lift his nose toward the front of the trailer, where Kestrel's hat hung on a hook near the driver's seat. "Easy, boy," Kestrel called back through the small window. "We're almost home." The word home seemed to resonate with the stallion. His ears flicked forward, and he let out a soft whinny that sounded almost like a question. When they finally arrived at the small farm, Kestrel was shocked by what he saw. The moment the trailer doors opened, Midnight Star stepped out and immediately began exploring with his nose to the ground, following invisible scent trails that seemed to tell him stories about the place. But it was his reaction to the old barn that took Kestrel's breath away. The stallion froze at the entrance, his nostrils flaring wide. Then, with a sound that was part recognition and part grief, he walked directly to the third stall on the right, the same stall where Thunder had lived during his brief stay at Kestrel's farm nearly 20 years ago. "How do you remember?" Kestrel whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. But Midnight Star wasn't done with his revelations. As Kestrel hung his hat on the same hook where it had hung for decades, the horse moved closer, his massive head extending toward the tattered fabric. This time, however, he didn't just smell it, he began to mouth it gently, his lips working over the various patches as if reading Braille. "He's cataloging memories." Kestrel realized each piece of fabric carried a different scent, a different story. The blue square from Thunder's blanket, the red patch from a saddle blanket that had belonged to Kestrel's wife's mare, the green strip from a horse named Comet, who had died saving a child from a burning barn, the yellow piece from a therapy horse named Sunshine, who had helped dozens of disabled children learn to ride. As Midnight Star worked his way around the hat, his behavior continued to change. The tension that had marked his every movement for 3 years began to melt away. His tail stopped its anxious swishing. His ears, which had been constantly swiveling in search of threats, stayed focused and forward. "You understand, don't you?" Kestrel said softly, reaching out to stroke the horse's neck. "You understand that this isn't just a hat, it's a memory. Keeper, a love keeper." The stallion's response was immediate and profound. He turned his great head toward Kestrel and, with the gentleness of a butterfly landing on a flower, rested his muzzle against the old man's chest. The gesture was so tender, so full of recognition and gratitude, that Kestrel felt tears streaming down his cheeks. "Stellan told me that love doesn't die," Kestrel whispered into the horse's ear. "He said it just changes form. I think maybe he was right." Over the following days, the transformation in Midnight Star was nothing short of miraculous. The horse who had been deemed dangerous and untrainable became gentle and responsive, but only with Kestrel, and only when the hat was present. If Kestrel removed it, even for a moment, the horse would become agitated, pacing and whinnying until the tattered headpiece was restored to its rightful place. The relationship between the two became the stuff of local legend. People would drive from miles away just to witness the sight of the shabby farmer and his magnificent stallion, moving together in perfect harmony. The horse who had refused to be ridden by anyone now carried Kestrel with the careful precision of a mother carrying a child. But the real magic happened in the quiet moments. When Kestrel would sit on his porch in the evenings, his hat resting on his knee, Midnight Star would stand nearby, his head lowered so that his nose was just inches from the fabric. Sometimes, Kestrel would tell stories about the various patches, and the horse would listen with the attention of a devoted student. "That piece there," Kestrel would say, pointing to a small square of leather, "that's from the bridle of a horse named Wistba. She was blind in one eye, but she could find her way home in the darkest storm. And this one," he touched a strip of fuzzy material, "this came from the blanket of a pony named Patches, who lived to be 38 years old. Oldest horse I ever knew." With each story, Midnight Star seemed to absorb not just the words, but the emotions behind them. He was learning the language of love, the dialect of memory, the vocabulary of connection that exists between all living things. Word of the miraculous partnership spread throughout the county like wildfire. Beaumont Ashford, still stinging from his defeat at the auction, arrived at Kestrel's farm on a Tuesday morning with a check for $100,000 and a sneer on his face. "I'm prepared to double what you paid," he announced, stepping out of his pristine Mercedes. "That horse belongs with someone who can appreciate his breeding." Kestrel was in the pasture with Midnight Star, both of them working on repairing a section of fence that had been damaged in the previous night's storm. The stallion's ears flattened at the sound of Ashford's voice, but he stayed close to his owner, drawing comfort from the presence of the tattered hat. "He's not for sale," Kestrel replied without looking up from his work. "Everything is for sale," Ashford insisted, his voice rising with irritation. "Name your price." $150,000. $200,000. I can give you enough money to buy a dozen horses." That's when Midnight Star did something that made both men freeze. The stallion walked over to where Kestrel's hat hung on a fence post and carefully lifted it with his teeth, carrying it to his owner like a dog bringing a beloved toy. He set it gently on Kestrel's head, then stood protectively beside him, his dark eyes fixed on the intruder. "Did you see that?" Ashford's voice was barely above a whisper. He brought you your hat. He does that," Kestrel said simply, "adjusting the brim when he thinks I need it." The truth was even more remarkable than it appeared. Over the weeks since the auction, Midnight Star had developed an uncanny ability to read Kestrel's emotions. When the old farmer was sad, the horse would bring him the hat. When he was tired, the stallion would position himself so that Kestrel could use his strong back for support. When storms frightened him in the night, the horse would stand outside his bedroom window, a silent guardian against the darkness. "It's impossible," Ashford muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier arrogance. "Horses don't think like that. This one does," Kestrel replied, "because he understands what this represents." He touched the brim of his hat, feeling the dozens of patches that told the story of his life. He understands that love isn't about what something looks like on the outside. It's about what it carries on the inside, as if to prove the point. Midnight Star began to exhibit behaviors that defied everything the experts thought they knew about horse psychology. When children visited the farm, he would lower his head to their level, allowing them to touch the patches on Kestrel's hat while he stood motionless. When elderly visitors struggled to walk, he would position himself as a living support beam, his strength available to anyone who needed it. Most remarkably, he began to seek out other animals in distress. When a neighbor's dog was struck by a car, Midnight Star stood vigil beside the injured animal until help arrived. When a barn cat had kittens, he would bring them scraps of hay for their nest, carrying the strands gently in his teeth. "He's learned empathy," said Dr. Cordelia Reitmere, a veterinarian and animal behaviorist who had driven 3 hours just to observe the phenomenon. "I've been working with horses for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's as if he's absorbed the emotional history of that hat and made it his own." The scientific community was baffled, but the local farmers understood. They had seen the power of love transform broken things before. They had witnessed the miracle of second chances, the magic of being truly seen and understood. Cordelia Whitmore arrived on a Thursday, her designer clothes looking out of place in the humble farmyard. She carried herself with the same arrogance that had marked her behavior at the auction. But her voice was different, softer, more uncertain. "I want to make you an offer," she began, but then stopped as she watched Midnight Star approach. The stallion moved with the fluid grace of a dancer, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. They were filled with peace, with purpose, with something she couldn't quite name. "How much?" she asked quietly. "He's not for sale," Kestrel repeated, but his voice was kind. "But you're welcome to visit anytime. I think he'd like that." And to everyone's surprise, Whitmore began to cry. The transformation in Cordelia Whitmore was as dramatic as it was unexpected. She began visiting the farm regularly, not to make offers on the horse, but to simply sit and watch the daily interactions between Kestrel and Midnight Star. Something about their bond had touched a place in her heart that had been closed for years. "I lost my daughter in a riding accident," she confided to Kestrel one autumn afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. She was only 12. "I blamed the horse, blamed myself, blamed God. I thought if I could own the most beautiful horses, the most expensive ones, it would somehow fill the hole." Kestrel listened in silence, his weathered hands gently brushing Midnight Star's mane. The stallion seemed to sense the woman's pain, moving closer to where she sat on the fence rail. "But watching you two," she continued, "I realize I've been looking for the wrong thing. I've been trying to buy love instead of growing it." That conversation marked the beginning of a transformation that would ripple through the entire county. Whitmore began visiting local horse rescues, not as a buyer, but as a volunteer. She worked with abused and neglected animals, learning the patience and humility that Kestrel had demonstrated. Her expensive clothes gave way to practical work gear, and her manicured nails became dirty from honest labor. Beaumont Ashford took longer to change, but even he couldn't ignore the evidence of what he witnessed at Kestrel's farm. The man he had mocked at the auction had achieved something that all his money and status couldn't buy: a true partnership with a magnificent animal. The horse who had been deemed dangerous and untrainable was now a model of gentleness and wisdom. "I don't understand it," Ashford admitted to his wife one evening. "That ridiculous hat. It's like it has some kind of power." "Maybe," his wife replied thoughtfully, "the power isn't in the hat. Maybe it's in the man who wears it." The truth was more complex than either of them realized. Over the months, Kestrel had begun to notice changes in himself as well. The isolation that had marked his life since his wife's death was giving way to a sense of community. People from all walks of life were drawn to his farm, not just to see the famous horse and his owner, but to experience something they couldn't quite name. Children who had been afraid of animals found courage in Midnight Star's gentle presence. Elderly people who had given up on life discovered renewed purpose in caring for the farm's other animals. Couples on the verge of divorce found healing in the simple act of watching two very different beings choose to trust each other completely. "You've created something special here," said Pastor Millicent Faraway, who had driven from the county seat to see the phenomenon for herself. "It's like a place where hearts remember how to be whole." The old farmer smiled, adjusting his tattered hat. "It's not me," he said simply. "It's the stories. Every patch on this hat carries a story of love, of loss, of hope. Midnight Star doesn't just see the fabric, he sees the souls who touched it." As winter approached, Kestrel faced a decision that would test everything he believed about love and letting go. Midnight Star had attracted the attention of a therapeutic riding center in the state capital. They needed a horse with his unique sensitivity to human emotions, his ability to calm and comfort people in distress. "We could help hundreds of children," explained Dr. Harrison Quinby, the center's director. "Children with disabilities, trauma survivors, kids who have given up on themselves. This horse could change lives." Kestrel spent sleepless nights wrestling with the decision. He loved Midnight Star more than he had loved anything since his wife's death. The thought of separation was almost unbearable, but he also understood the deeper truth that the horse had taught him sometimes. The greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. On a crisp December morning, Kestrel made his decision. He would donate Midnight Star to the therapeutic center, but with one condition: he would come too, as a volunteer. At 73 years old, he would learn new skills, take on new challenges, and most importantly, he would ensure that the horse's gift for healing would be shared with those who needed it most. The day of departure was both heartbreaking and beautiful. The entire county seemed to turn out to say goodbye to the horse, who had taught them about the power of love over judgment, substance over appearance, and connection over isolation. As Kestrel loaded Midnight Star into the trailer, he carefully hung his tattered hat on the same hook where it had traveled on that first day. The horse immediately moved closer, breathing in the familiar sense of memory and love. "We're going on an adventure, boy," Kestrel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to help people remember what you taught me, that love doesn't die. It just changes form." Midnight Star's response was a gentle nicker that seemed to say, "I understand. We'll do this together." 5 years later, the therapeutic riding center had become renowned throughout the region. Midnight Star, now known as Star, had worked with over 300 children, each one touched by his remarkable ability to sense and respond to human emotion. Kestrel, despite his age, had become the center's most beloved instructor, his tattered hat now famous among the families who came seeking healing. But perhaps the most beautiful part of the story was how it had changed everyone involved. Cordelia Whitmore had opened her own horse rescue, focusing on animals that others had given up on. Beaumont Ashford had sold his mansion and moved to a small ranch, where he bred horses for therapy programs. Even Rusty, the old handler from the auction, had found new purpose working with difficult horses, always remembering the lesson he had learned that day about looking beyond the surface. The tattered hat itself had become something of a legend, its patches now numbering in the hundreds as people from around the world sent pieces of fabric with their own stories attached. Each new edition was carefully sewn in place by Kestrel's patient hands, creating a living tapestry of love, loss, hope, and healing. And at the center of it all, an old farmer and a magnificent horse continued their partnership, proving every day that the most powerful forces in the universe can't be bought or sold. They can only be shared, one heart at a time. The last entry in Kestrel's journal, written on his 80th birthday, reads simply, "They mocked the farmer's tattered hat, but the horse knew better. He saw what they couldn't, that love isn't about what something looks like on the outside. It's about what it carries on the inside. And when we learn to see with the heart instead of the eyes, we discover that the most beautiful things in life are often hidden in the most unexpected places." Midnight Star, now 22 years old and still working his magic with children who needed healing, stood in the pasture beside the therapy center, his head high and his eyes bright with purpose. On the fence post beside him hung the tattered hat, its patches fluttering in the evening breeze like prayer flags, each one carrying a story of love that would never die. In the end, they had all learned the same lesson, that true value isn't measured in dollars or appearances, but in the capacity to love, to heal, and to see the sacred in the seemingly ordinary. The farmer's tattered hat had become a symbol of that truth, and the horse who loved it like a blanket had become its greatest teacher. The story of love had found its most satisfying ending not in a single moment of triumph, but in a lifetime of transformation, one heart at a time.